In the 1st century AD, the area around the Bay of Naples served as a holiday resort where the ancient Romans could either visit the town of Herculaneum on the coast or travel further inland to the town of Pompeii. The area, it seems, was used mainly by wealthy Romans. Pompeii itself had impressive civil buildings, sports arenas, theaters, and temples. In Herculaneum, villas lined the Bay of Naples decked out with fine furnishings. In their prime, these villas must have been an incredible sight. Today, the sad remains of these once thriving towns lie silent and mournful under the Italian sun. Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed by a huge natural disaster, a violent volcanic eruption which entombed both towns in ash and rock. But that same disaster has also preserved a unique picture of life in ancient Rome, nearly 2,000 years ago.
One of the great things about Pompeii, as well as being a superb archaeological story, it was also almost a terrific detective story as well, because there was so much we did know about Pompeii, but until this century there were also a great deal of unresolved mysteries.
Pompeii was founded on the end of a natural outcrop, actually an old lava flow from Vesuvius, which came down very close to the mouth of a river, which formed a natural bay on the Bay of Naples. And it would look as if the first moves to settle Pompeii permanently were taken in the 6th century BC.
When a natural catastrophe strikes, it is often unexpected and brings with it terrible consequences. The unexpected eruption of Mount Vesuvius was one of the most violent natural disasters of all time. At noon, on August 24th, AD 79, the peak of Vesuvius suddenly erupted. A horrifying crash shook the earth violently. As the crater split open, a column of ash, rock, and smoke was thrown over 15 miles up into the atmosphere. Daylight turned to darkness as the thick cloud mushroomed, blocking out the sun. At once, the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum were thrown into panic and confusion. It seems that only a few people died in the initial eruption, but the next day, thousands were entombed in Pompeii, taken by surprise by the powerful explosive flow of red-hot rock and ash.
The red-hot ash and debris from the volcano, when it comes tumbling down the side of the mountain, is almost gelled together, so it becomes a kind of liquid, like a river. It flowed down over the mountain and through the city, and it was this that did this destruction in Pompeii.
It had begun like any other summer's day. The sky was clear, and the sun shone brilliantly. The shimmering water of the Bay of Naples was calm and turquoise blue. The lush green slopes of Vesuvius provided the dramatic backdrop for the summer scene. People were going about their daily business, and the rich, safe town of Pompeii hummed with activity. Roman mythology suggested that volcanoes were gateways to the underworld, but the people who lived in the Bay of Naples region thought that Vesuvius was simply a large hill. Vesuvius had been silent for almost 1,000 years. How could the population possibly know that a savage disaster was about to consume this thriving, prosperous, and apparently secure Roman town? Therefore, no one knew or recognized the significance of the warning signs. Over the previous few days, there had been some minor earth tremors. All local sources of water had dried up. As morning broke on August 24th, AD 79, the weather was excellent. People moved on with the business of their daily lives. The market stalls were open. Tradesmen had removed the shutters from their shop fronts and were busy selling their merchandise. The bars served snacks and wine, and the bakers offered freshly baked bread. The doors of the public baths were open for business. Women filled jars with water from the public fountains. As the morning passed without event, families and friends gathered to eat lunch together. Then Vesuvius erupted. The huge explosion drew people out into the streets. As they stood aghast, looking at the volcano, the burning rock, ash, and pumice poured out of the crater. The sun vanished, and Pompeii was plunged into darkness. Chaos broke out as people panicked and fled. For the next 12 hours, there was a constant heavy downfall of scorching pumice and ash. It buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under 6 feet of debris. The traditional explanation is that all those who died at Pompeii were buried under the fallout from the volcano. It was only after close studies of the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens that the real truth about the fate of Pompeii became graphically clear. We owe our knowledge of the events that terrible day to 2 letters, which have survived for nearly 2,000 years. They were written to the historian Tacitus in AD 104 by Pliny the Younger. He was the nephew of Pliny the Elder, admiral of the Roman Mediterranean fleet, which was based at Misenum, to the north of Naples. Pliny's letters vividly describe the eruption and tell us how his uncle died on the beach at Stabii. Pliny the Elder was a keen scientist and wished to see the results of the eruption at close hand. So he ordered a ship to be rowed across the bay, hoping to save as many people as possible. He left his nephew behind at Misenum. The rough seas and falling rocks made it difficult to land, so Pliny ordered the ship to row to Stabii, at the south of the bay. While trying to reach the shore, Pliny the Elder was overcome by poisonous fumes and died.
At the time of the explosion, Pliny the Younger left us a very detailed record of the events. First of all, he describes the initial explosion, which we now know was probably the result of the pressure underneath the volcano. And what's very interesting is that he subsequently describes the collapse of the cloud of ash and smoke and how it sweeps over the landscape.
Young Pliny tells us after several violent tremors, he feared that his house would collapse. He persuaded his mother that they should leave as the tremors continued. Next, he witnessed what would become known to science as a pyroclastic flow, in which he described an ominous thick smoke spreading over the earth like a flood, which followed behind us. Pliny and his mother escaped into the fields, but were surrounded by darkness. All they could hear were the screams and wails of the men, women, and children. When the daylight returned 2 days later, it revealed a chilling scene. Almost all the southern end of the bay had been buried. The whole center of Mount Vesuvius was blown out by the eruption, and where the sides had collapsed, a vast new crater had been created. The enormous cone of Vesuvius was now just a stump. The slopes of the volcano, where lush woods, vineyards, olive groves, and villas once stood, was now a wasteland. Earthquakes and tidal waves had destroyed buildings, and all the remains were covered in a thick layer of ash.
Pompeii represents the ideal archaeological site. It is actually a complete assemblage of buildings and their contents, and all manner of references to particular individuals within a known context, and that's really the appeal of Pompeii, with the added advantage even that it was actually stopped at a particular moment in time.
At Pompeii, the tops of ruined buildings were the only visible reminder that it had ever existed. Soon, even these were taken to be used to build new shelters for the homeless. Mount Vesuvius remained active for another 1,300 years, until around 1400, coating Pompeii with layer after layer of volcanic debris. The puzzle for scientists was always to explain why so many of the citizens died, and why the mangled bodies were found on top of the ash which filled the streets, and not buried beneath. After all, the people could simply have fled indoors to avoid the falling rocks, and most would have survived. Lava from volcanoes flows slowly, and it is fairly easy to avoid, so it could not have been that which killed the inhabitants. Recently, scientists have discovered that what actually killed them was a sudden and violent torrent of burning hot rock and ash, which flowed over Pompeii.
That's why we find that a lot of the bodies are actually on top of the preliminary ash and rock from the first eruption, because when that was thrown into the air and rained down on Pompeii, it was fairly easy to avoid that. All they had to do really was to go indoors to avoid the falling ash. But when people on the second day were hit in the streets, that's when the bulk of the people were killed. That's why we find so many bodies that have been dismembered and mangled in such a severe way.
About 5,000 people died at Pompeii, 1/4 of its estimated population. The survivors probably fled on the first day of the eruption. Those who remained behind were sealed in with the rest of the town, like a time capsule. Ash and rock surrounded their remains. Soil concealed the site, and plants and shrubs and trees grew among the ash. At the time of the eruption, the citizens of Pompeii enjoyed an era of thriving development and peace. By AD 79, the town had become a prosperous commercial center with an industrious, creative, and growing population. The prosperity of the town is reflected in the splendid public buildings. The Forum was the religious, political, and economic center of the Roman resort. Market stalls stood along covered doorways where customers haggled over goods. At the south end of the Forum were the council offices and the law courts. The north end was dominated by the temples of Jupiter, Laurus, and Vespasian. The wool and cloth markets, the main market, the fuller's building of Eumatia, and the office of weights and measures formed the commercial center of the Forum. Nearby were other public buildings, including a sports ground, the Temple of Isis, and the Temple of Jupiter Malachiosis. In the area near a second sports ground was the vast amphitheater.
One of the most interesting aspects of Roman civilization is this fact of living in cities and the nature of Roman towns. And Pompeii has a theatre, an amphitheatre, basilica. It has all the features that make up the sort of model Roman town.
The public baths were built on main roads. These formed an essential part of daily life. Some roads had a more commercial nature, with shops and taverns. Also, a semi-rural area with vineyards and gardens survived in the center of the town. Almost all of the remaining areas of the town were residential. Rooms facing the street could be let out as shops or taverns. Sometimes whole houses were transformed into laundries, bakeries, or small factories. Rich and poor, families and businesses lived and worked in very close proximity. Estates on the fertile slopes of Vesuvius grew grapes, olives, cereal, vegetables, and animal food, or reared animals. Pompeii needed its own market garden to keep up supplies of food. Pompeii's other main industries were the production of wine and woolen cloth. Many Pompeians made their living either manufacturing items for export or importing other items from abroad. Some agricultural produce, such as wine and olive oil, was exported as far as North Africa, while pottery was imported from southern France. Thanks to Pompeii's thriving seaport, sea traders operated a complex network of contacts with the Orient, Africa, and Asia.
From the moment of its foundation to the moment of its destruction, its primary function as a city was as a port for the area. This is one reason actually why Pompeii was probably not rebuilt after the eruption. It could have been salvaged. It wasn't that deeply buried, but it's very possible that its harbour, that its port, its actual raison d'etre was destroyed in the eruption.
The people of Pompeii seem to have found a great deal of time for leisure, rest, and relaxation. The town certainly had a variety of activities on offer. The great theatre showed comedies and tragedies to spectators, who were protected from the sun by covers and sprinkled with scented water. The second main venue was the Odeon, which was used for concerts, poetry recitals, and lectures. The enormous amphitheater held the games and had a capacity of 20,000 people, who took their places according to a strict social hierarchy. The games included such spectacles as gladiator fights, animal duels, or hunts, and possibly chariot racing. The gladiators were incredibly popular. They lived and trained in the nearby barracks. 63 people died there in the eruption. In their duels, most gladiators were killed on their first appearance. Those who survived won respect, freedom, and wealth. In the centuries following the eruption, people slowly returned to live in the area, establishing new towns and villages. But Pompeii's time capsule was to remain undiscovered until the 18th century. One of the most famous sights of Pompeii are the plaster cast bodies. These are not actual bodies, they are made from the molds of impressions left by bodies buried in the ash. This process reveals an astonishing amount of detail: clothes, shoes, and facial expressions. These terrified and tortured faces of those who died in the eruption have been preserved for almost 2,000 years. The reason for the excavations at Pompeii was that archaeologists and historians could use the discoveries to piece together a picture of the town, the townspeople, and life in the Roman Empire. So, why did the tragedy strike Pompeii? Could the town's death have been avoided? Vesuvius lies on the fault line that also includes the nearby volcanoes Etna and Stromboli. Depending on the activity of these plates, a volcano can lie dormant for many years.
Volcanoes occur at weak points in the earth crust where the pressure of the molten rock beneath forces its way through the surface. In most instances, volcanic eruptions are relatively harmless because lava moves very slowly and people generally have time to avoid it. Where it gets dangerous is where there's a pressure beneath the Earth's surface which results in effectively a huge explosion, and that's what's happened at Pompeii.
prior to AD 79, Vesuvius had been totally inactive for almost 1,000 years. But inside the Earth, the pressure grew, and molten rock, known as magma, collected in the volcano's chamber. Eruptions occur when the pressure under the plates is strong enough to force the magma through weak spots in the Earth's crust. When this magma reaches the surface, its path may be free, in which case it would flow slowly down the sides of a mountain. Or it may be blocked, in which case there can be a huge eruption. The eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79 showed the consequences of such a blockage. When dormant, magma deposits in the crater and shaft may cool and solidify, forming a plug. If the magma cannot escape, the pressure eventually smashes and explodes the plug out, blasting ash and rock fragments thousands of meters into the air. This is what happened at Pompeii. There were warnings that would have alerted modern scientists. Earth tremors and the natural sources of water running dry due to the rise in ground temperature are just two clues which warn of an eruption. But how were the residents of Pompeii in AD 79 to know the significance of these things? It was when Mount St. Helens in Washington erupted in 1980 that the answers to these mysteries were revealed. As the scientists watched from a safe distance, they witnessed a previously unknown phenomenon. As the sides of the volcano exploded, a wave of rock and ash spewed out of the crater. Like the flood that Pliny the Younger had written of after AD 79, it traveled at 100 miles an hour at a temperature of 200 degrees centigrade, scorching and smashing everything in its path. For those that had pondered the fate of Pompeii, all the pieces fell into place. Today at Pompeii, much of the site remains unexcavated. Archaeologists now use modern technology and equipment to sift the remains for the last clues to the past. Preservation and conservation experts work on mosaics and paintings, protecting them from the weather and restoring them to their best condition. Under the ash, Pompeii had been safe, but the wind, rain, eruptions, and earthquakes have continued the destruction of the town. Preserving the uncovered ruins is just as vital as continuing the excavations.
Pompeii, unfortunately, is a ruin, and just like any ruin, it's likely to become more ruinous the more time it spends exposed to even quite normal weathering. The problem with the modern environment that is also full of pollutants. The other thing is that tourists themselves are quite a challenge to the structure of the town. The numbers of people who walk through the remains each year, which run into their hundreds of thousands, can also bring a considerable amount of damage with them.
It is a major task to protect Pompeii so that future generations have the benefit of learning about the town and of life in the Roman Empire. It is also important that these future generations learn about the death of Pompeii. The busy Italian city of Naples lies in the shadow of Vesuvius, but the volcano has been silent for over 50 years. But, as Pompeii proves, this does not mean it is not active. Naples today is densely populated. The weather and work are good. People are happy and getting on with their daily business. It is a modern-day reflection of Pompeii, and just as vulnerable.